Hi, this is Jaya. In this video, we shall see the summary of Satires by Horace. This is a collection of satirical poems which were written in Latin in dactylic hexameters by the Roman poet Horace. It was published probably in 35 BC or by 33 BC, and the first book of Satires represents Horace's first published work. It established him as one of the great poetic talents of the Augustan age. The second book was published in 30 BC as a sequel of the first book. In the first book of his Sermonies or Satire, Horace combines Greek philosophy with Roman good sense to convince his readers of the futility and silliness of their ambitions and desires. As an alternative, he proposes a life that is based on the Greek philosophical ideals of autarkia, that is in Greek it is inner self-sufficiency, and metroids. It is the equivalent of Greek for moderation or sticking to the just mean. The second book also addresses the fundamental question of Greek Hellenistic philosophy, the search for a happy and contented life. In contrast to Book 1, many of this second book's poems are dialogues in which the poet allows a series of pseudo-philosophers such as a bankrupt art dealer turned stock philosopher Damasippus, the peasant Ophilus, the mythical seer Tiresias, and the poet's own slave Davis to expound their philosophy of life in satiric contrast to that of the narrator. Book 1, Satire 1.1, How Come Mechanism. This satire targets avarice and greed. Most people complain about their lot yet do not really want to change it. Our insatiable greed for material wealth is just as silly. The true basic human needs are food and water, which are easily satisfied. A person who recognizes the natural limit set for our desires, that is the just mean between the extremes, will in the end leave the banquet of life like a satisfied guest, full and content. Satire 1.2, The Colleges of Syrian Music Girls. This satire deals with adultery and other unreasonable behavior in sexual matters. Horace claims that there is also a natural mean with regard to sex. Our basic sexual urges are easily satisfied, so it seems silly to run after married noble women when free women are available. Satire 1.3, All singers have his vice. Horace demands fairness when we criticize other people's flaws. In the case of friends, we should be especially lenient. Satire 1.4, Eupolis and Cratinus. In a programmatic declaration of Horace's poetic views, he applies these same critical principles to poetry and shows that his own satires follow them. Satire 1.5, Having left great Rome. Horace describes a journey he made from Rome to Brundicism in the spring of 36 BC in the company of the poet Virgil, his patron Maecenas, and others. Alluding to a famous satire in which Horace's predecessor Lucretius described a trip to his estates near Tarentum, this poem offers a comic self-portrait of Horace as an insignificant member in the retinue of his powerful friend Maecenas when the latter negotiated one last truce between Antony and Octavian, the peace of Brundicism. Horace pitches a scura, that is buffoon, from the capital, the freedman Sarmentus, against his ultimately victorious local challenger Messius Circus, that is the fighting cock. Satire 1.6, Not because Mechanism. With the same modesty with which he just depicted himself in Satire 1.5, Horace explains why he is not interested in a career in politics, even though during the Civil War he once served as the tribune of a Roman legion. People would jeer at him because of his freeman father, and his father taught him to be content with his status in life, even though he made sure that his son could enjoy the same education as an aristocrat. Satire 1.7, The Pus and Poison of the Proscribed Ripulus Rex. This satire deals with a court case that Perseus, a Greek merchant of mixed birth, won against a Roman Ripulus Rex. Following the account of Horace's youth in 1.6, this satire tells a story from his service under Brutus during the Civil War. As in 1.5, it features a verbal contest in which two different kinds of invective are set against each other. Initially, Greek verbosity seems to succumb to Italian acidity, but in the end, the Greek wins with a clever turn of phrase, calling on the presiding judge Brutus the Liberator to do his duty as his ancestor and done and dispose of the king Rupillus Rex. Satire 1.8 Once I Was a Tree Trunk. Prapius, a wooden garden fertility god, narrates the visit of two terrible witches to Mecaena's garden that he is supposed to protect against trespassers and thieves. Mecaena's garden on the Esquinal Hill used to be a cemetery for executed criminals and the poor, and so it attracts witches that dig for magic bones and harmful herbs. The god is powerless until the summer heat makes a fig wood that he is made of explode, and this divine fart chases the terrified witches away. Satire 1.9 I happen to be walking on the sacred way. Horace is accustomed by an ambitious flatterer and would-be poet who hopes that Horace will help him to warm his way into the circle of Mecaena's friends. Horace tries in vain to get rid of the boor. He assures him that this is not how Mecaenas and his friends operate. Yet he only manages to get rid of him when finally a creditor of the boor appears and drags him off to the court. Satire 1.10 I did indeed say that Lucius's verbs hobble along. This satire functions as an epilogue to the book. Here Horatius clarifies his criticism of his predecessor Lucius, jokingly explains his choice of the genre in a way that groups him and his satires among the foremost poets of Rome, and lists Mecaenas and his circle as his desired audience. Book 2, Satire 2.1 They are those to whom I seem too harsh in satire. Horace, who is anxious his satires are making him unpopular, pretends to consult the famous jurist Gaius Tribatus Testa, who advises him to give up writing or else to write an epic poem in honor of Augustus. Horace replies that epic is beyond him and that just like his predecessor Lucius, he can still enjoy the friendship of great men while writing satire. Satire 2.2 How great a virtue it is to live on little. Horace writes about the virtues of living on simple fare. He claims to be quoting a certain Ophelius who lost his land in the confiscations following the Civil War. Satire 2.3 If you write so rarely, a certain Damasippus, a follower of Stoicism, criticizes Horace for being lazy and writing so little. Damasippus explains that he used to make a living buying and selling, but lost all his money and went mad until a philosopher called Stertinius rescued him. Damasippus describes various different kinds of mad people: creditors, misers, insane spenders, over-ambitious people, prodigals, spendthrifts, infatuated lovers, superstitious people. He says Horace is mad too, writing poetry in a bad temper and living beyond his means. Satire 2.4 Way from and way to Catius. Horace meets a certain Catius who is hurrying home to write down some precepts about food, wine, and cookery, which he has heard from a certain expert on gastronomy. Catius stops to tell Horace what he has heard. At the end, Horace begs him to allow him to meet the expert himself. According to Palmer, this Catius is a thinly disguised version of Gaius Matius, a friend of Julius Caesar, Octavian, Cicero, and Tribatus, who wrote 3 books on gastronomy. The unnamed expert was most probably Matius himself. A letter written to Cicero from Matius and Tribatus jointly is preserved among Cicero's letters. Satire 2.5 Tell me this to Tiresias. Ulysses, when consulting the prophet Tiresias in the underworld, asks him for advice on how to repair his broken fortunes. Tiresias advises him to become a toady to some rich man in the hope of getting a legacy from the man when he dies. Satire 2.6 This was in my prayers. Horace begins by expressing his delight with life on the country villa, which he has recently been given by his patron Maximinus. He contrasts life in the city, which he finds disagreeable, apart from his opportunities to converse with Maecenas. Even then, people jostle and sneer at him when he is on his way there. He returns to a description of his pleasant life on his farm, with books, simple fare, pleasant neighbors, and sensible conversation. The satire ends with a retelling of the famous tale of the town mouse and the country mouse based on one of Yusuf's fables. Satire 2.7. I've been listening for a while. A slave called Davis asks permission to speak. Since it is December, Horace gives him permission. He tells Horace some philosophical truths he has learned from another slave, Crispinus, doorkeeper, and argues the stock principle that none but the wise are free. He shows that Horace, who is always criticizing other people of being inconsistent, is inconsistent himself. Horace criticizes his slave for vices like desire for sex, picture mania, gluttony, restlessness, but is just as bad himself. At the end, Horace has had enough and tells the slave to make himself scarce or he will join the other 8 slaves working on the farm. Satire 2.8. How was dinner with Nasidius? Horace says he heard that Fundenus, a comic poet, was at a banquet at Nasidinus' house and asks him to describe. Fundenus describes a lavish banquet at which he and Mechanus were present with expensive food, wine, and slaves. The host got alarmed when 2 guests called for more wine. While the host was boasting about the quality of the food, a wall hanging suddenly fell into the dishes and he burst into tears. The next course came and the food would have been delightful if the host hadn't been praising it so much. According to Palmer, Nasidinius is possibly to be identified with a certain general Quintus Salvius Salvinius Rufus, who was put to death by Octavian in 40 BC, about 10 years before these satires were written. And here ends the summary of all the satires. If you have anything more to add on to what I've said, please write it in the comment box, like the video, share it with your friends, and if you have not subscribed my channel, please subscribe and support. Thank you.